Hello, everyone. We are so excited to be here with you today. My name is Rachel Coppola, and I am joined by Julian White, and we are going to talk with you about utilizing campus services and resources to build your global leadership map. And again, big shout out to Leaders of the Free World for organizing this. I've been listening all day, getting pumped, so excited, and can't wait to share some additional insights with you all and get you excited about taking advantage of all the resources that are available to you at your various universities and colleges. So let's introduce ourselves. Again, my name is Rachel Coppola, and I am the Senior Associate Director at the University of Delaware Career Center. And I'm joined by Julian White. Julian, you want to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. I hope you're looking forward to a great weekend. As Rachel pointed out, my name is Julian White. I'm coming to you live from Temple University, where I work as the Senior Director for Undergraduate Advising in the Fox School of Business, one of the largest business schools in the area. Happy to talk, looking forward to speaking to you about some of the ways services on campus can really make a big difference.
So, you all have been hearing a lot about studying abroad and getting connected and leadership. And we want to talk a little bit about resources and how you can connect to some of those things throughout your various universities. And I'm going to let Julian talk about this slide because
Absolutely.
he picked it. And I just think it is a wonderful way to kind of reflect on how we want you to approach this next part.
Couldn't think of a better cue up, Rachel. So thank you for that. So obviously, hopefully everyone knows who that is. Obviously, that's Albert Einstein, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, often touted as the smartest living human, although maybe that's debatable. But I usually begin a lot of my presentations with that particular quote by Einstein. So I have to give credit where credit is due. And it speaks to the notion that, how we define a problem is often more important than the solution itself. There's various variations on that phrase, right? So some people may say it's not the destination, but the journey. Some may say the joy is not found in finishing the activity, but in actually doing it. But the point behind all of these statements are that, how you view a problem will often determine your actual behaviors and actions for resolving it. And if we put it within the context of our presentation, one of the trends I found and one of the themes I'm going to come back to is that we tend to focus a lot when it comes to higher ed on graduation and getting that degree, often at the expense of some of the intentional actions and behaviors that we should be doing each semester that surround that very thing. And Einstein himself represents a good example of that. Again, smartest guy, published his first scholarly paper at the age of 16 years old. And this is well before the internet, when publishing really meant something. But it actually took Einstein 9 years to get a job in academia, which people often confuse with graduating from college. But the point was, the length of time had nothing to do with his knowledge. In fact, people often described him as rebellious, had a penchant for skipping classes. And it was mostly because, for him, it wasn't so much he was fixated on that end goal, which at the time college was a pathway to teaching in academia. It was more about the joy of learning. He wasn't in it for graduation. He was in it to sort of expose himself to the people around him and the ideas that inspired him. And while I'm certainly not advocating you don't go to class, I am suggesting that you take full advantage of everything college has to offer right now. And that's kind of what we will be honing back in on. So next slide, please.
So to that end, one of the reasons Julian and I were so excited to present this particular presentation to you all today and talk with you is because expanding your awareness of the resources is also about expanding your individual power and then the collective education of the community. Because, there's that saying, Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. And we want you to know and take advantage of all of the resources that are available to you at your various colleges and institutions and feel empowered to walk through those doors, email those people, ask questions, and connect. One of the hashtags that came up in the last session was keep knocking, right? So that whole idea of you are paying for a university experience that is bigger than just what's happening in the classroom. There are things happening all across the university that you will want to be taking care of. and you will want to take advantage of. And so we want to make sure that you are aware of what they are, know how to advocate for yourself to get them, and then also be empowered with how you want to approach those offices to get the resources. So let's talk a little bit about some facts and myths. There are a lot of myths when it comes to student offices and resources on campus and different departments in higher education institutions. And we wanted to highlight a few of those myths and counter them with the facts so that you leave informed from this session about what you can and can't access within those different settings. Next slide. Julian and I I'm laughing because Julian and I both worked in advising in the same office, just not at the same time. I was there before Julian got there, but we both worked as academic advisors and kind of moved up in our university work. And so I'm going to talk about this first myth, and I'm going to let Julian talk about that second myth. That first myth, all academic advisors do is register students for classes. I think we can both attest to the fact that that is a myth that continues to kind of permeate students thinking when it comes to, I just go to that office to pick my classes for the next semester. Yes, you can do that, and you can work with them to make sure that you're aligning your graduation goals, but you can also talk with them about creating an individual plan of study, about what was talked about in the session earlier, mapping out if you want to go abroad, when and how to do that. And so really, you don't want to think about the advising center as the place you go to register classes. You want to think about it as a bigger place than that. Julian, you want to?
Absolutely. So I think for many college students, especially those who come in knowing what major they want their freshman year and having those blinders up and not even wanting to deviate from it, they're the ones who typically think of academic advising as A, being unnecessary, or B, being an unnecessary drag. In fact, I was guilty of that, right? So I started college as a psychology major. Never thought about anything else. Embarrassed to say, I never even used an academic advisor. And so the fact that I'm running an office now speaks to how, certainly my mindset has been expanded. And I've always advocated that it might be more effective to define them as consultants, not advisors, because the same way, if I'm investing in stocks, I want someone who's going to tell me how to make wise choices. If I want to see a doctor, I want someone who's going to give me some choices. Advising in some respects is giving you guidance, not just on your major. And I think that's the biggest myth, but on everything available to you at a university. So, for me, one of the biggest takeaways, spoiler alert, is that if you get nothing else from this presentation, know that if you are uncertain about where to start or how to begin engaging in any of the activities you've either heard today or that I hope to impress upon you will really make the difference between a constructive and maybe a less than satisfactory college experience, I can tell you that it usually will start with an academic advisor. I don't expect you to memorize everything and learn everything right away, but knowing who to go to help you figure that stuff out can make a big difference.
Absolutely. Career centers are also a place that carry a lot of myth. And some of the myths that have been around about career centers is that it's only for seniors. You only have to go there when you're ready to find a job, or you have to know what you want to do before you walk in the door, and this one's not on there, but that's that place where they help you with your resume. That's one that we hear a lot. And there's also that myth that career, because the word career is a part of that of the center's name, that you don't go there if you're trying to go to graduate school. You only go there if you're trying to go and get a job. But career centers are actually there for you from the beginning of your academic experience all the way through graduation. And in many centers like mine, we help with alumni. And so your ability to tap into the resources at a career center are so much bigger than I'm ready to find a job or I need an internship, let me go talk to them. We work with students in career centers who don't know how they need to get started, don't know where to start. We work with students who are struggling to try to figure out what they want to do. Maybe they have one or two paths that they're trying to figure out if they want to take and which one is right. And for those of you who are geeks like me and love the Matrix, I'm here to say there is no path, there is no spoon, right? There's not one fit. Many of us are going to pivot. I mentioned earlier that I worked in advising. One of the one of the places that I always referred students to and then found myself working in that space was a career center, because you can pivot. There's no stigma in moving careers and understanding like what's out there and how you might navigate. And so again, a career counselor can help you figure some of that out and at least start figuring out how you want to curate your next steps, because it's not just, I'm going to figure this out and go for the rest of my life and be in this one job. Most people are going to pivot throughout their careers and not have one particular job. So we can also help dismantle some of the myths around what's going to happen outside of the door. And then the other piece to that is higher education beyond your bachelor's degree. You've seen a lot of people with masters and doctorates talking with you today. And career centers can actually help you figure out how which graduate programs you might want to go to, how to prepare for those graduate or professional schools, those LSATs, those MCATs, those GREs. There's a lot of resources at a career center that can help you tackle that, as well as the writing that you're going to have to do for your essays, your personal statements, your interview preparation. So it's not just, I need to find a job. But I do want to say, if you are looking for jobs and internships, the career center is absolutely where you can go. But again, I want you to think of it as something much more than that. Leadership programs. This is a leadership summit, right? And a lot of universities have leadership programs built into them. And so you really want to seek out, if your university has a leadership program, is that something that you might get involved in? And again, those myths, leadership's something you have to be born with, right? Or I'm a leader in my student organization or my fraternity or my, registered student organization or something like that. So I don't need to learn what it means to be a leader. And actually leadership programs can really help you kind of synthesize and define for yourself how you want to be perceived as a leader. What are the qualities you want to develop? How can you get a better understanding of yourself and how you might be perceived by others? Leadership programs provide a framework for you to move through their different programs and sessions and workshops and really start to tackle that, which is going to help you when you start to need to articulate how you define yourself as a leader. And so it's not something that you have to do on your own. It's also something that could be great on a resume as you're starting to build your resume at the universities that you are at, and demonstrate to a future employer or a graduate program that you have a requisite set of skills. Sometimes a leadership program can be an indicator that, yeah, I'm picking those things up. I've had experience in that beyond just my student club or organization or beyond just my community service and things like that. So really want to encourage you to check out the leadership programs at your schools and see if there's some that you might want to get involved in. And I loved one of the speakers in an earlier session that talked about how he was the beginner, like he started he blazed the trail when he started studying abroad, and that caused other people to want to do that. You might join a leadership program and maybe you are the only Black male in that program. Bring a friend, right? It's an opportunity for you to go through that together and really have that experience, and then possibly bring in other people. So again, don't look at it as something that you even have to do by yourself. Leaders know when they need support. Leaders know how to ask for help. Leaders know how to refer, right? So these are all things that can help you.
And the one thing I just wanted to quickly add to that, Rachel, is that leadership often begins with mentorship. And so oftentimes to that notion that leadership is learned, if you are ever struggling or wanting to begin a pathway towards becoming a leader yourself, it's often sometimes beneficial to find someone who's already occupying a similar space who can sort of give you information and tips that will help you navigate some of the same challenges they may have seen, but also identify where and how you can effectively engage others.
Absolutely. And we didn't even put mentorship programs in our list. There's so many different programs at universities, and sometimes it can feel overwhelming that there's so many different opportunities to get involved. But really, again, just keeping your mind open to those, asking questions, looking around, and not being afraid to, again, keep knocking. I'm going to say that a lot through this. I think that was one of the best hashtags I've heard this session. And I think that's something that we all want to keep doing as we progress through our our growth and professional development. This particular slide is talking about studying abroad. We don't really have to go into a lot of that because you all just came out of a session about that. And so I feel like all the myths that we have here have been dispelled, right? And you are now hopefully eager and really trying to find the places on your campuses and even just across the United States, because remember, a lot of them are multi-university applicable study abroad programs. You don't have to just pick the one at your school. So hopefully this one we won't spend a lot of time on because I feel like we've dispelled the myth. But I will say from personal experience, one of my greatest regrets in my undergraduate experience is the fact that I did not study abroad. And it was an opportunity that was presented to me. I went to Grambling State University in Louisiana, and we had study abroad, and I had professors trying to get me to study abroad, but it was a familial kind of holdback for me. My family was like, "Oh, you can't go, don't leave us," and there was a lot of like angst around me studying abroad when I was in college. And so I did not go abroad until I was out of undergraduate. And it's, again, one of those regrets that I have. And so you don't want to be one of those people that says, I wish I had. You want to be one of those people that says, this is what I did, and wasn't it fantastic?
And picking up on resources that can really prove beneficial. So I don't have to tell anyone that we've come through some of the roughest 2 years, a pandemic, institutions that have switched from in-person to online. And so I felt it important to also acknowledge that counseling centers and services are also one of those resources that oftentimes go underutilized and yet should be part of the lexicon as it pertains to resources that can really help. Now, there's certainly lots of myths out there in terms of counseling and who it's for. It's for crazy people. Doesn't change anything. It's a waste of money. And yet, if you really think about where counseling is today, where its focus is more on wellness and not so much, a treatment modality, but more a getting yourself to your best place. I feel that some ways removes some of the stigma and makes it more likely that folks can take advantage of it. There's been a lot of chatter about where and how your student fees go. Spoiler alert, the counseling center is one of them as well. So just in terms of maximizing, your return on what you're investing in your college experience, making sure that you take advantage of it, because it might be one of the few times where you would have access to a service like that at no cost whatsoever. I think it's also important to point out that people often think about going to the counseling center when things are at their worst. So, you're depressed, you're anxious, you're not sure about classes, and all that can very well be true. But it can also be to sort of help reinforce things that are going extremely well. And so sometimes, a counseling center and services offered through counseling can be about optimizing the good things, helping you recognize them when they happen, but also helping you manage things around you so that you're able to put yourself in positions for those good things to come. Next slide. And I think for all of these, right, so this presentation, has as one of its headers, Black men. And so I think it's important to point out that if you look at the literature, if you look at the history about what are some of the barriers for accessing any of these, it would be remiss not to put culture at one of them, right? And one of the biggest myths is that, utilizing these services, it doesn't work for Black, Indigenous people of color or BIPOC, right? That oftentimes we find ourselves going towards other avenues to get things done, whether it's friends or family. And I'm reminded that part of why that happens, and it's not just in academia, right? It happens when people talk about doctors. Black people don't go see doctors or therapists, or in lieu of things like church or talking to people in their neighborhood. And it has to do with the fact that, there is this common theme that to be marginalized means you're living in a culture where you're often having to work around or against systems. And so then when you come to college, you embody that same attitude where you're not going to work within that system because how much can you trust it? Instead, you want to work with the folks around you who look like you, who you can trust. And then out of the last quote, obviously, if you watch the Super Bowl, Kendrick Lamar was one of the performers at one of, what people are pointing to as one of the most unforgettable halftimes. And he did the song "We Gonna Be All Right," which, if you're familiar with the lyrics, in many respects, speaks to that very theme, because it starts very much with and I'm not going to rap here, but it's the all my life I has to fight, all my life hard times, bad trips. But if God got us, then we're going to be all right, right? Homie, we're going to be all right. So it's this notion that we can be confronted with lots of adversity. But if we use the things that are familiar to us, we're going to be okay. And that works to a point. But if you look at some of the facts, that it can also come at a real consequence, right? And so some of the stats there are why it's sometimes important to break that cycle. So, independent of who's represented here, Black males still only constitute about 5% of all students at undergraduate institutions across the nation. And then it gets even worse when you look at the completion rates, where only 1/3 will complete their degree, which is, unfortunately lowest amongst completion rate among both sexes and all races. And then in terms of the things we're talking about here, part of why that may happen is that there's often this negative attitude towards help seeking in educational settings and going and to take advantage of some of the resources we've been talking about. And so hopefully we can do some of the work now to talk about why that might be happening and how we can maybe not allow us to set us back.
So what we want you all to consider is to create your own plan. And to figure out how you want to do that, you need to start from where you are, right? You want to think about, where do I ultimately want to go? What do I ultimately want to know, learn? Again, taking that moment to reflect, to think through, here's where I am, here's where I want to go. And if you aren't sure about that, right, you can think, where should I go to get that support? If you're not sure, again, that's where that career center comes in. That's where talking with your academic advisor might come in. But those are, or even going to the counseling center can come in, so that you can figure out what this process is. That self-assessment piece is so key as you start to figure out what your next steps are going to be. You need to self-assess. Who am I? What do I want? How do I want to get there? And again, sometimes it's helpful to just do some simple self-reflection, but you don't have to do that by yourself, because there are career center offices where you can go and talk to someone, or there are assessment tools, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, that can help you kind of break that down. You want to self-assess though, and then you want to determine possible pathways. And the career center that I work at, we talk a lot about Odyssey planning, and it's this idea of crafting. It's a life design philosophy of crafting, like plan A, plan B, plan C, right? I'm a former banker before I got into higher ed. And so I believe you don't put all your eggs in one basket. You have to figure out, like, what are the things? You can be passionate about something and still create some backup, still have some ideas in your head about where you might want to go next. Because again, we're in this really dynamic world where people aren't staying and doing the same thing for 40, 50 years. They're moving, they're integrating things that they've learned along the way. And so by determining possible paths, what we call Odyssey planning, coming up with, like, if things went really well for me, this is what I would want to do. If that doesn't work out, here's my plan B and here's my plan C. And then once you figure out what those plans are and you start to map that out, then you can start to seek out the resources and programs that align with those areas. So if I'm thinking about becoming, going into actuarial science, or I'm thinking about going into, ethical technology services, which is this integration of philosophy and computer information systems, right? What are the things I need to do to help me get there? What are the programs? What are the, beyond just your academic major, again, what are the resources? Looking at those job descriptions and thinking, like, what are they saying that I need to have? And then figuring out, okay, they're talking a lot about leadership. Maybe I'll go into a leadership development program. Or they're talking a lot about, strong communication skills. Maybe I'll visit the writing center and really learn how to hone those skills. So again, mapping that out after you self-assess, figure out what your strengths and weaknesses are, figure out what your possible pathways are going to be, and then seek out those resources. And this next slide, I think, kind of sums up how we want you to approach this, right? And this is a Venn diagram about purpose. And what I want to encourage you all to do is write some things out, do some self-reflection, or have some talks with people, with those mentors that you might have in your life. Think about, what is it that I love? Write that down. Think about the things that you are most interested in and make a list of that. Make a list of what you think your strengths are. Make a list of what you think the world needs. When I was at Grambling, I remember having a professor that used to require us to watch the news every week and then reflect on that and talk about what we saw happening in the world, what we thought we could do to improve the world, right? So when you think about your profession or what you're going to do after graduation, really thinking about kind of, How am I going to make a difference? What do I think the world needs? And then also thinking, what can I get paid for, right? When you think about what you can get paid for, that might really need some more reflection. And I say that because the top 10 careers that exist now didn't exist 10 years ago. So what you think you might want to do is great, but there could be something even better out there. Marcus King talked in an earlier session about the fact that he realized that his company that he created just kind of for himself was something he could get paid for. And he made that expression. He said, wait, what? I can get paid for this? So again, you never know until you start to kind of think things through and map things out. And if you look at this Venn diagram, you can see that there's things that we've talked about. You've probably heard people talk about your career, your calling, your cause, all of those different things, your vocation, right? Don't get hung up on these words. What I really want you to do is think about, how might I move forward with the next steps after graduation? And again, you're not necessarily going to have the answer right now. That should hopefully make you think, let me check some resources to see if I can fill in some gaps or connect some dots, because that's where you might find purpose. That's where you might find satisfaction. That's where you might find that next step, right? And, I can look at this diagram, and I'm sure Julian can look at the diagram and kind of map out where he landed. And I can look back on my career, and I would challenge you all to do this. Look back on your life thus far, because some of you have had part-time jobs. Were they things that you were passionate about, or were they things you were using to pay the bills? Is there something you might want to do a little bit further in the future? One of the things I love to do is work with students. And my strength is working. I've trained to work with students. My PhD was on working with students and figuring out how environment influences career choice. And I thought what the world needs is more access and opportunity for students of color. And so how can I kind of manifest that career and also get paid to do that work? And so my purpose lined up in time with the experiences, the skills that I had built up, the strengths that I had. But that took time. It's not I'm going to graduate and boom, I'm in this perfect career. You're going to start out and you're going to move through passions and professions and vocations, and that's okay. The point, though, is to keep moving.
So I teach a freshman seminar class, and oftentimes on the very first day of class, I usually drop a pop quiz, and it has these 3 questions on it, which if we were in person, I might ask you all to take yourselves. Can we put the 3 questions up? And so obviously, these questions range across disciplines, right? We've got science, we've got math. I would imagine that for most people in here, they probably don't know the answers, or at least to one of them, right? And when I ask it of my seminar class, which usually numbers anywhere between 40 to 50 students, I rarely have any students, and I've taught for about 10 years, who get all 3 correct without using their smartphones. And I think that's one of the keys, right? So you usually take away the phone and they can't answer it. But they're often then shocked to realize that if you go to the next slide, right, a lot of these questions are taught in the 5th grade, right? And so it's not to suggest that today's college students are now any more or less intelligent than a 5th grader. Instead, it speaks to the reality that a lot of what we have come to assume about college has sort of evolved, and knowledge alone has become less and less important, primarily because a lot of the information we need, we can now access through the device in our pocket, which is, again, that smartphone. So learning something alone can't be the only motivation for college. And coming out of classes with just a set of facts, as important as that may be, is only getting you halfway there. We often tell students, if you graduate with all A's, with no activity, no engagement, no stories, then you're not going to be any more competitive than any other student who's done the exact same thing. And then where will that truly take you? And when you put that in the context of why we would maybe highlight that when we're talking about accessing services, can you go to the next slide? It has to do with the fact that in many respects, that's a byproduct of our American education system, right? Which in many respects can work against the goal of working interactively and in collaboration with your campus, because a lot of what happens in the class may run explicitly counter to it. So there's a big focus on individual achievement. It's all about you versus working with the resources and people around you. There's a huge specialization where you have to be excellent in a specific area versus cultivating a variety of interests. So you need to know this class and know everything I'm teaching you, and oftentimes just that major. It's about risk aversion, right? So the goal is to avoid getting a failing grade, to avoid a consequence in some respects. Certainly, it can be very passive. So if it's a lecture, for example, you're often being asked to listen and be told what to do versus some of the more discovery and risk taking. And it often leads you towards some extrinsic incentives, whether it's a grade, grade, scholarships, accolades, etc., versus that more intrinsic sort of self-actualization and growth that may come from a more broader utilization of services. And so for us, and then you can go to the next slide, it's becoming less about what you know, and instead what you do with what you know. And oftentimes that's kind of been how we've been trying to sort of redefine, what the goal of college might be and how you might channel some of that energy, some of that education in a more substantive way. So how do we channel that motivation for engagement? And for us, it oftentimes helps to distinguish, between passion and strengths, right? If the goal is to drive people to move beyond what they learn to sort of take actions in ways that they may not have otherwise, then oftentimes it's good to sort of hone in on, what drives us, what fuels us. And oftentimes it's one of those two things. It's something that we either love to do or it's something that we know we're very good at. And I would imagine everyone here has a one of the two, right? So we may all have passions: music, dance, sports. We may have strengths: reading, right? And to be clear, they don't have to be disconnected from each other. But most of our behavior tends to be driven by one or the other. And right now, a lot of the focus tends to be more on passions. It's usually when people ask you, or when you consider what motivates your acts, you're taught to pursue your passions, to do what motivates you the most. And that can work, but there could be a consequence there too. So the next picture I put up just highlights that, if I were operating on passion alone, right? And if I were looking at my younger college self, then the photo of the shaved Buddhist monks ready to take a karate chop might have better reflected a future for me, right? Because one, I was excited and passionate about reading. I was very much into spirituality and psychology, and I also loved kung fu and anime. So if you dialed up all my passions, you might get an algorithm that produced something like this. And yet that speaks to why passions alone would not necessarily get me moving in some of the directions that might be necessary to take advantage of not only the resources around me, but to actually occupy a certain professional space. Did you want to speak about the next picture? Yeah.
Yes, thanks, Julia. So that
No,
second,
go back.
go back. Sorry, Sophia. This picture of the library and the tree was my contribution to this, because again, as Julian was saying, when we think about passions, one of my passions is reading. And, if I could have been a hermit in a book, reading a book someplace by myself, forever, just pouring into the knowledge into myself, I could be satisfied doing that. But if you think about that Venn diagram we showed earlier, how is that helping me help the world? How is that? I'm certainly not making any money living in a tree reading books all day. Probably wouldn't be able to have those books. And so again, that idea of our passions aren't always the things that are going to give us the greatest satisfaction in our life. Sometimes we have to figure out which passions can we combine with our strengths to help us move forward.
And so the next slide just speaks to how passion is becoming, sort of part of our lexicon. So if you look at how often it's mentioned in books, it certainly has blown up since the 90s. And then to the next slide, though, just speaking again to some of the trade-offs, right? So if you had to guess sort of the percentage of folks who are able to find occupations that align specifically with their passions alone, you might be surprised at some of the results, which is on the next slide. You can kind of see that oftentimes, students will articulate being passionate about sports, being passionate about arts, being passionate about music, but the occupations in those fields tend to be very small in nature and oftentimes very limiting. So it would not be sufficient alone to drive to do that. And so certainly going back to what I alluded to earlier, the pandemic has also been a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of people because it has caused us to sort of reevaluate our lives and our careers. Speaking personally, it's now natural to think if I'm going to spend so much time at work, I might as well do something I'm passionate about. But there are also benefits of thinking about it a little bit differently, which is instead of pursuing a career based on your passions, how can your career be a conduit to your passion? And then sort of picking up on that same theme, how do you then stay persistent? Because if passion is the fuel, but yet you're driving towards something or engaging in activities where you may not have that, what we've often found is a level of grit that can help as well. And if we go to the next slide, I mentioned, sorry, you're next, Rachel. So
that's okay. Keep going, because I think your thought is, I think you should finish that thought.
So I was going to simply speak to the fact that there's a different energy you can exploit if the passion is not necessarily there. So I often work with business majors who are driven to pursue marketing, but because our curriculum is an accredited one that you have to learn everything, whether it's accounting, finance, they tend to cringe at the more quantitative aspects of it, but you got to get them through it. And oftentimes there's a level of grit training that I'm able to get to. And the next slide, I'll speak to that, but I want to bring you back to here. So, well, no, go back and then
yeah.
And then
that's fine. I just wanted to point out competencies. I would be remiss as a career professional if I didn't point out that these are the top competencies that employers are looking for in students. And if you look at these competencies, they don't connect to a particular major, but they do connect to resources on campuses. Communication can connect to the Writing Center or that leadership skill, leadership group that you might join. Leadership obviously points straight to leadership. Teamwork and orientation, career and professional development, they all connect to career offices and advising and study abroad and all those things that you can pick up outside of the classroom, but that are really valued by employers.
Thank you. And so next slide. And so I mentioned that I teach at Temple University, which is located in Northeast Philadelphia, rough neighborhood, but a wonderful campus. And so when I'm working with my seminar class, I usually like to point to people they know. And obviously everyone knows Will Smith, right? Famous rapper, famous actor, political activist in his own right. But he gave an interview several years back that spoke to what his drive is. And so I'm going to play the clip and then come back to it. It's a really short one.
Yourself. The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill, right? I will run.
You would not be outworked.
I will not be outworked,
right?
Period.
Yeah.
You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might be sexier than me. You might be all of those things. You got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, right? There's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple.
And so, I play that, and I play that for my seminar class because in large part, what my goal as an academic advisor is to help them find their own treadmill, to figure out, what is the thing that drives them and fuels them, that will sustain them through some of the tough times, but also ensure that if we're identifying opportunities or resources that we know will potentially enhance their experience, how do we make sure that when things get tough, when they don't have me there talking to them, when they're feeling depressed or down, that they're still able to rally themselves and still utilize that energy to take advantage of it. And so I like the idea that of all the things we know Will for, being a fast runner is not one of them, because in many respects, that thing that drives you may not necessarily translate into the actual thing you're doing, whether it's your major career, et cetera. So.
And I think that's a really great way to kind of remind you all that this next slide is a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, and it really kind of sums up the fact
that I see,
other than Will Smith saying, "I will die on a treadmill." That is not the quote I want to leave you with. The quote I want to leave you with is, "The day you plant the seed is not the day you eat the fruit." So we've talked a lot about how you can plug in different resources, how you might reflect and think about what you want to do with your future, and how you can figure out what are the resources that can get you there. But we also want you to walk away knowing that it's not an overnight thing. It's not something that's going to happen instantly. When you are planting a seed, it takes time. You have to water that seed. You have to make sure it's in good ground and surround and fertilize it and do all of that. And then it grows and becomes the future that you want. And so what we want to leave you with today is the fact that it's a journey, right? And it's a process, and that it should be enjoyable. It should be something that you are looking forward to, not something that has you worried. And we want to remind you, and I think a lot of people have said this, that we are here to support. Regardless of what institutions you all go to, we want you to connect with us. We want you to reach out. And so Julian and I just put our LinkedIn information up here for you, so that if you want to connect, because we're not in person, we don't get to talk with you all after this is over, right? We don't get to have those face-to-face conversations right now, but we can offer support and resources and help you figure out how you want to take those next steps, and also direct you, because we're connected to a lot of different universities, connect you maybe to some of the people that you should be connecting to hashtag keep it moving. Last slide. So just some reminders today. This is the end, but we do have that. You have a poll that you need to take, so please don't forget to take that poll. Please don't forget that there is more to come after this. There's another session coming up. There'll be about 15 minutes that you have between that. And we really hope that you all, take advantage and enjoy the journey. I'm checking see if there's any questions. No. Oh, I love that. Ruby's putting in some, she put my LinkedIn. I guess she's, Julian, you're next.
Well, this was great. And as Rachel pointed out, I think one of my regrets is, as she pointed out, this is happening virtually, so we don't have an opportunity to sort of become more familiar and talk with you all. But but hopefully our LinkedIn helps reduce some of that. And this has been great. So awesome. Thank you.